Something happens after 70 that nobody prepares you for. Not the slowing down, not the aching knees or the earlier bedtimes or the reading glasses on every surface of the house. Something else entirely. Something that takes most people completely by surprise because they spent decades dreading this chapter of life, and it turned out to be one of the best things that ever happened to them. They stopped caring about things that used to keep them up at night. Not because they gave up. Not because they stopped living or loving or feeling, but because somewhere in the accumulated weight of years, something clarified. The noise that had been constant for so long went quiet. The things that had felt urgent for decades simply stopped feeling urgent. And in that space, something that had been waiting patiently underneath all the noise finally arrived. Peace. My name is Dr. David Mercer. I've spent 28 years studying aging patterns in over 9,000 patients between the ages of 65 and 95. And what I have observed again and again in people from every background and every circumstance and every kind of life is that the decade after 70 brings a shift that most younger people cannot imagine and most older people cannot fully explain. Not a loss, a liberation, a shedding of weight that the person did not even fully realize they had been carrying until it was gone. And then the lightness was undeniable. I want to tell you about 7 things my patients consistently stop worrying about after 70. Not because a doctor told them to let go. Not because they read something in a book or attended a seminar or made a resolution, but because life itself, with its particular and unhurried gift of time and perspective, made these worries simply fall away. And in falling away, they made room for something that most people spend their entire lives looking for. A man named Harold came to see me a few years ago. He was 74. He had been a high school principal for 31 years. A man who had never missed a deadline, never let a ball drop, never stopped pushing himself and everyone around him toward the next thing. He sat across from me for his annual visit, and I noticed something different about him. He seemed lighter, not physically. Something in his posture, something in the way he sat in the chair without the forward lean of a man waiting for the next obligation to arrive. "Harold," I said, "you seem different this year." He thought about it for a long moment. He said, "Doctor, I stopped carrying things I was never supposed to carry in the first place." That is one of the most precise descriptions of what happens after 70 that I have ever heard from a patient. Subscribe right now. What I'm about to share is something most people spend their entire lives waiting to feel. Thing number 1. You stop worrying about what other people think of you. This one arrives so quietly that most people do not notice it happening. One day they realize they are wearing what is comfortable instead of what is correct. They are saying what they actually think instead of what the room expects. They are leaving parties early without apologizing, declining invitations without elaborate excuses, and disagreeing with confident people without the internal rehearsal and second-guessing that used to occupy entire days. The research behind this shift is real and substantial. Psychologists who study personality across the lifespan have found that the trait called neuroticism, which includes sensitivity to social judgment and fear of disapproval, declines significantly in most people after age 70. The brain's threat detection system, which spent decades scanning every social interaction for signs of rejection or criticism, gradually reduces its vigilance. Not because the person becomes careless, because the accumulated evidence of a life lived has made the question of other people's opinions simply less important than it once was. For decades, concern about external opinion is functional. It helps young people navigate social structures, build careers, form alliances. But after 70, after the career has been built, and the family has been raised, and the major chapters have been written, that vigilance becomes unnecessary weight, and the nervous system, with the wisdom of its own biology, begins to set it down. Eleanor was 72. She came to see me a year after retiring from a career in public relations, a profession built entirely around managing how things appeared to others. 30 years of crafting messages, anticipating reactions, adjusting tone for every audience. She sat down and said something I have never forgotten. "Doctor, last Tuesday I wore my gardening clothes to the grocery store, dirt on my knees and everything. There was a moment in the parking lot where I thought someone might see me, and I realized I genuinely did not care who did. Not as a defiant act, not as a statement, just a plain fact. I did not care. I asked her how that had felt. She looked at me with the quiet certainty of someone who had come upon something long searched for. Like the first day of something, she said. Not the end of something, the beginning. That is the distinction that matters most. The worry about judgment does not fade because the person has stopped caring about the world. It fades because they have finally fully arrived in their own life. They have moved from performing their existence to simply living it. And the difference between those two things, when you finally feel it from the inside, is enormous. Many of my patients describe this shift as the most unexpected gift of their later years. Not health, not financial security, not grandchildren, though those are precious too. The gift of walking through the world no longer braced for a verdict that was never coming from anywhere that mattered. Thing number 2. You stop worrying about being perfect. The relationship most people have with their own imperfection before 70 is exhausting in a way that is almost impossible to see until it is over. The unfinished sentences rewritten in the head after the conversation ends. The project reviewed one more time before sending. The appearance adjusted before walking out the door. The constant background hum of not quite enough that runs beneath decades of achievement and effort and doing. After 70, this hum begins to quiet for most people. Not because standards disappear, not because quality stops mattering, but because the accumulated weight of a life looks fundamentally different from inside a life that is mostly already lived than it does from the vantage point of a life still being constructed and defended. The mistakes that felt catastrophic at 40 are simply chapters at 75. Chapters, not verdicts. Evidence of a life lived forward into uncertainty rather than proof of fundamental inadequacy. The failures that kept people awake at night are now, from the distance of years, just evidence that they tried things, that they showed up, that they lived forward without knowing the outcome, and they survived every single time. Because you are still here, and still here is not nothing. Still here is everything. Walter was 76, former architect, a man whose professional identity had been built on precision for 4 decades, on the meticulous attention to detail that meant the difference between a building that stood correctly and one that did not. He came to see me and mentioned almost in passing that he had taken up oil painting since his retirement. I asked how it was going. He laughed. "Terribly," he said. "I am genuinely bad at it. The proportions are wrong. The colors fight each other. Last week I painted a tree that looked like it was apologizing for existing. I asked if that bothered him. He thought about it for a moment with the careful consideration of someone who takes the question seriously. He said, "Doctor, for the first 3 weeks it bothered me enormously. I almost quit. Then one morning I just looked at what I had made, this terrible apologetic tree, and I thought, this is what I made today. And today that is enough." He paused and looked out the window. I have not thought that about anything since I was about 9 years old. Something that leaves with childhood and comes back again in the later years, if the person is paying enough attention to notice it. The ability to do something imperfectly and find it worthwhile anyway. The ability to be a beginner without shame. To try without needing to succeed. These are not small things. They are the conditions of a life that still feels alive. Thing number 3. You stop worrying about time. Not in the sense of ignoring it, not in the sense of pretending it is unlimited, but in the way that people before 70 often experience time as an adversary, something to be beaten, managed, optimized, squeezed until it produces enough. After 70, for many people, the relationship with time undergoes a fundamental reversal. Time becomes something to inhabit rather than something to spend. Researchers who study what they call the time perspective shift in older adults have found that after 70, most people move away from future-oriented thinking and toward present-moment engagement. The brain that spent decades planning and projecting and preparing for what comes next begins to redirect its attention to the texture of what is happening right now, in this moment, in this room, with this person, at this table. This is not resignation or giving up on the future. It is a neurological and psychological recalibration that produces, in most people who experience it fully, a profound and sustainable increase in daily satisfaction and emotional well-being. Not because their circumstances are better, because their attention is finally, fully here. Catherine was 71. She came in for her regular visit and told me something she said she had only just noticed. She said, "Doctor, last week I sat on my back porch for 45 minutes in the middle of the afternoon, and I did not feel guilty once. Not once. I sat there watching a bird at the feeder, and I was just entirely there." I asked her what had changed. She thought about it carefully, the way she always did, weighing the words before she said them. "I think I finally believe that sitting on my porch is something I am allowed to do," she said. "That the day does not owe me more productivity than that, and I do not owe the day more output than that. I am allowed to just be somewhere." For most of her adult life, rest had been a reward earned by sufficient productivity. It required justification. It came with conditions. You could rest after you had done enough, and enough was a threshold that kept moving. After 70, that threshold dissolved. Rest became simply a part of living, available without negotiation, without guilt, without the sense of time stolen from something more important. I have watched this shift arrive in patient after patient, and I am still moved by it every time. Because what it represents is a person finally giving themselves permission to exist, without constantly earning that existence. Thing number 4. You stop worrying about the opinions of people who were never truly for you. This is a more specific and more profound version of thing number 1. It is not just the general concern about judgment that fades. It is something more targeted. After 70, most people find themselves naturally, without effort or analysis, simply no longer interested in the approval of people who did not show up during the hard times. The colleagues who took credit, the relatives who kept score, the friends who were present only during the easy years. Their opinions, which once held a strange power, simply stop registering. Researchers who study social connection in older adults have documented what they call the pruning effect in social networks after 70. People actively and without regret reduce the number of relationships they invest in, choosing depth over breadth, quality over obligation, genuine connection over social maintenance. What the research also consistently shows is that this reduction is accompanied not by loneliness or diminishment, but by measurably higher emotional satisfaction. The energy that had gone into maintaining connections that were draining or hollow or built entirely on shared history rather than genuine affection is redirected toward the relationships that were real all along. The ones where you can stop performing and simply be known. Ruth was 73. She came to see me and mentioned that she had recently stopped attending a monthly lunch with a group of women she had known since her working years. I asked her why. She said, "For 30 years I left those lunches feeling worse than when I arrived, and I was never completely sure why I kept going. There was something about stopping that felt like admitting something, like it would mean the time I had already given had been wasted." She paused. I think I was more afraid of being right about it than I was of the lunches themselves. I asked what had finally changed. She said, "I think I simply ran out of time to spend on people who made me feel small. I had always known they made me feel small. I just finally decided that knowing it was enough reason to stop going." It was not anger when she said this. It was not bitterness or resentment. It was the particular quiet clarity of someone who has done an honest accounting of what is worth protecting and arrived at a conclusion that no longer requires defending. That is what the social pruning that happens after 70 actually feels like from the inside. Not loss, not isolation. The replacement of quantity with something better. With depth. With honesty. With the relationships where you can put down every version of yourself you perform for others and simply be the one that is actually you. Thing number 5. You stop worrying about the future in the way that used to keep you awake. There is a specific kind of future worry that most people carry for decades, not concern about practical matters, but the ambient dread of things that might happen, the catastrophic projections, the worst-case imaginations that run in the background of an otherwise ordinary day. What if this goes wrong? What if that changes? What if the thing I built does not hold? After 70, for reasons that are both psychological and neurological, this particular form of worry tends to lose its grip. Part of this is experiential. By 70, most people have lived through enough of their projected catastrophes to understand from the evidence of their own lives that the worst rarely matches the imagined version. They have lost things and survived the loss. They have been wrong about outcomes they were absolutely certain of. They have watched the things they dreaded most arrive and then watched themselves navigate through them anyway, imperfectly and sometimes painfully, but through them. This accumulated personal evidence quietly dismantles the credibility of catastrophic projection in a way that no amount of therapy or advice or reassurance can fully replicate. Life itself becomes the proof that you are more capable of surviving difficulty than your worst projections ever allowed you to believe. James was 78. He came in for a routine visit and mentioned that he had stopped watching the news approximately 8 months earlier. I asked why. He said, "Doctor, I spent 60 years being afraid of things that might happen. Most of them did not happen. The ones that did, I managed somehow. I kept watching anyway because stopping felt irresponsible. Like if I looked away, something terrible would happen, and it would be my fault for not watching." He shook his head slowly, as if I had some power over any of it from my living room chair. I asked what he did with the time the news had occupied. He said, "I water my tomatoes. I call my brother," which I had been meaning to do more of for about 15 years. "I read things I find interesting instead of things that are designed to make me afraid." He looked at me with the particular calm of someone who has made a deliberate choice and is entirely at peace with it. Not avoidance of the world, not denial of its difficulties. A considered withdrawal from a manufactured stream of dread toward the actual life that was right in front of him, waiting to be fully lived. "I water my tomatoes," he said again. And then he smiled. "They are extraordinary tomatoes." Thing number 6. You stop worrying about having all the answers. For most of a life, not knowing feels like a problem to be solved. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. Ambiguity demands resolution. The mind that does not understand something spends considerable energy trying to understand it, because understanding has always felt like the prerequisite to safety, to control, to the right decision. After 70, for many people, something in this relationship with not knowing softens. The tolerance for mystery increases. The need to resolve every question into a satisfying conclusion relaxes. And in its place comes something that younger people often mistake for indifference, but is actually a form of hard-won wisdom. The recognition that most of the important things in life do not come with explanations and do not require them. Dorothy was 74. She had spent her career as a research scientist, a woman whose entire professional identity had been built on the rigorous pursuit of answers, evidence, proof, reproducible results. She came to see me the year after her retirement and told me that she had started attending a philosophy lecture series at the local library on Thursday evenings. I asked what had drawn her to it. She said, "I spent 40 years looking for the right answers. It turns out I was much better at that than I knew, but somewhere along the way I forgot to ask whether they were the right questions." She looked at me with the slight surprise of someone who is still discovering something. I find I am more interested now in questions that do not resolve, questions that just open into more questions. I asked if that felt uncomfortable for someone trained in empirical certainty. She thought about it for a long time before answering. She said, "It feels like finally being honest. For 40 years, I pretended certainty I did not entirely have because the work required it. Now I am allowed to say I do not know. And it turns out, doctor, that I do not know is one of the most comfortable sentences I have ever said." That shift from demanding answers to finding peace in open questions is one of the quieter and more beautiful transformations that later life can bring. Thing number 7. You stop worrying about whether you have lived your life correctly. This is the deepest one, the one that arrives last and stays longest. For most of a life, there is a running parallel narrative. The version of the life being lived and the version that might have been chosen instead. The road taken and the road not taken. The choices made and the choices that were possible. After 70, for most people, this parallel narrative finally goes quiet. Not because the questions stop being interesting, but because the life that was actually lived has accumulated enough weight and texture and meaning that it no longer needs the comparison to justify itself. There is research from positive psychology suggesting that what is called the life review process, The natural and often involuntary tendency to look back and honestly assess the life one has actually lived peaks in the decade after 70, and for most people who engage with it honestly and without flinching, resolves into something resembling acceptance, not satisfaction with every choice made. Not the comfortable fiction that everything happened for a reason, but the recognition that the life was theirs, that they were there for it, that it happened and it was real, and it was, in the deepest and most honest sense, enough. Agnes was 80. She had come to see me for years. She had raised a family, worked a long career, outlived her husband by 9 years, and arrived at 80 with the particular quiet authority of someone who has been through enough to know what things actually weigh and what they do not. She sat down one afternoon and said, "Doctor, I used to lie awake wondering if I had done everything wrong, if I had made the right choices, taken the right roads, been the right kind of person." I asked when that had stopped. She thought about it for a long time, long enough that I stopped expecting a quick answer and simply waited. She said, "I think I realized one morning that lying awake wondering about it was not going to change a single moment of it, and that everything I had worried I had done wrong had somehow, through some path I did not choose and could not see, still led me here." She looked around my examination room with the calm of someone who has made a peace that cannot be hurried into and cannot be taken away. "Here is not so bad," she said. "Here is actually rather good. That is the whole of it, really. Not that regrets disappear or losses stop hurting, but that the life, the actual lived, particular, irreversible life, begins to be seen for what it always was. Not the life that should have been. Not the life that might have been. The life that was. The only one there ever was. And for most people who arrive at this reckoning honestly, it turns out to have been enough. More than enough." Harold came back to see me the following year. The former principal who had sat in my chair and said he had stopped carrying things he was never supposed to carry. I asked him what that felt like, a full year on from when he had first said it. He looked out the window for a moment, the way he always did when he was finding the right words. Then he said, "Doctor, I spent 40 years being very busy being worried." He paused and let the window have his attention for another moment. "Now I am very busy being alive. There is room for that now. There was not before. That is the gift that waits on the other side of 70. Not the end of caring, not the end of feeling, not the absence of difficulty or loss or the full, honest weight of being human, but the quiet arrival of a different relationship with all of it. The worry that does not come back. The peace that was always underneath everything, waiting for the noise to finally settle enough that you could hear it. You do not have to wait for it to arrive on its own. You can begin moving toward it today, by asking honestly what you are still carrying that was never yours to carry, by noticing what you still perform for an audience that stopped watching years ago, by letting one ordinary afternoon on a back porch with a bird at the feeder be enough without immediately turning it into evidence that you should have been doing something more productive. Peace is not something that happens to you after 70. It is not a reward for suffering enough or waiting long enough or finally getting everything right. It is something you recognize when you finally stop moving long enough to see that it was already there. It always was. Underneath everything, waiting,